You think you're worthy to touch that Guzheng. It once belonged to a prodigy you could never be. The words sliced through the glittering hum of the gala. The waitress froze mid-motion, her hand resting on the forbidden instrument everyone revered, but no one truly understood. No one there knew the masterpiece about to be performed was hers, stolen a decade ago after a fabricated scandal buried her name. The man mocking her now was the very patron who'd ordered her silence 10 years back. She smiled faintly, plucked a single string, and the hall's copyright recognition system lit up in alarm. Lyra No, in her plain black uniform, stood under the chandelier's glow, her fingers still brushing the ancient Guzheng. The alarm's soft chime cut through the chatter, and heads turned. Her face didn't flinch, didn't beg for attention. She just stood there, her dark eyes steady, like she'd been waiting for this moment for years. The room didn't know it yet, but the truth was about to unravel, and it would start with that single perfect note. The gala was in full swing, a sea of tailored suits and sparkling dresses, the kind of place where wealth screamed louder than words. Lyra moved through it, balancing a tray of champagne flutes, her steps careful but not timid. She wore no makeup, her hair pulled back in a simple bun, her plain black dress blending into the background. To the guests, she was invisible until she wasn't. The Guzheng sat in the corner, a 300-year-old relic, its polished wood catching the light. Dust speckled its strings, and Lyra's hand had moved toward it almost without thinking, like a reflex from a life she'd buried. That's when Vivienne Saul, the night star performer, spotted her. Vivienne, with her sleek red gown and diamond earrings, strode over her heels, clicking like a warning. "Don't touch that!" She snapped loud enough for the nearest tables to turn. That's a heritage piece, not something for a waitress to paw at. A woman nearby, her silk scarf draped just so, leaned forward, her voice dripping with condescension. Honestly, who let her near it? She looks like she's here to clean the floors. The crowd tittered, their laughter sharp and practiced, like they'd done this before. Lyra's fingers lingered on the string, her gaze dropping to the floor for a split second before she straightened. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself. Instead, she picked up a fallen napkin from the table, folding it with deliberate care. "Some things are worth more than they look," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried. The woman with the scarf blinked, her smirk faltering, as if Lyra's words had brushed against something she didn't expect. The moment passed, but the air felt heavier, like the room was holding its breath. Lyra turned back to her tray. Her movements smoothed, her face unreadable, but her hands betrayed a faint tremble as she set the napkin down. The crowd's amusement grew, a ripple of cruelty spreading. A man in a velvet blazer, his cufflinks flashing with emeralds, leaned toward his date and muttered, "Bet she doesn't even know what a Guzheng is." His date, her lips glossy and her dress tighter than necessary, giggled. "Probably thinks it's a fancy table." The laughter grew sharp and careless, like glass breaking. Lyra's tray didn't waver. She set down a flute, her movements precise, her face calm. But her eyes flicked to Vivienne just for a second, and there was something in that look, not anger, not hurt, but something heavier, like she was measuring the weight of the moment. "I knew someone who lived for its sound," she said, her voice soft but clear. The words landed like a stone in still water. Vivienne's smile faltered just for a beat before she tossed her hair and turned away. The crowd moved on, but the air felt tighter, like something unspoken was starting to crack. Across the room, a young reporter, his tie slightly crooked, scribbled in a notebook, his eyes darting to Lyra. He whispered to his colleague, a woman with sharp cheekbones and a press badge. "Did you see that?" The system flagged her touch. "That's not normal." The colleague shrugged, adjusting her camera. "Probably a glitch. She's nobody." But the reporter didn't look convinced, his pen pausing as he watched Lyra move through the crowd. She was clearing a table now, stacking plates with a quiet efficiency, but her hands moved with a rhythm that felt almost musical, like she was playing an invisible instrument. The reporter squinted like he was trying to place her, but the moment was interrupted as Damien Arden stepped into the circle, his presence like a storm cloud. At 38, he was all sharp edges tailored suit, slicked back hair, and a smirk that said he owned the room. As the main patron of the Celestia ensemble, he carried himself like a king, and he loved reminding everyone else they were beneath him. As Damien's voice boomed, a woman in a glittering gold dress, her perfume heavy in the air, nudged her companion. "Look at her shoes," she whispered loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Does she think this is a thrift store?" The companion, a man with a slick ponytail and a diamond pinky ring, chuckled. "Maybe she's here to bust tables, not dream about music." Their words stung sharp and deliberate, meant to cut. Lyra's hand paused over a glass she was clearing her fingers, tightening slightly around the stem. She set it down, her movements controlled, and looked at the woman in gold. "Dreams don't need your permission," she said, her voice low but steady like a quiet challenge. The woman's laugh caught in her throat, and the man's smirk faded. Lyra turned away, her tray balanced, but the room felt a little smaller, like her words had carved out a space no one could ignore. Damien looked Lyra up and down, his eyes lingering on her plain shoes, her unpolished nails. "A waitress thinking she understands music," he said, his voice loud, performative. "Stick to serving, sweetheart. People like you are born to carry trays, not create art." The room laughed again, but it was uglier now, like they were all in on a joke Lyra didn't know. She didn't flinch. She picked up an empty glass from a table, her fingers steady, and said, "Some people create more than you'll ever know." It was quiet, almost too quiet, but it cut through the noise. Damien's jaw twitched. He opened his mouth to fire back, but Lyra was already moving away. Her tray balanced her steps even. A woman at a nearby table, her earrings dangling like chandeliers, leaned toward her friend. Did she just talk back? The nerve. Her friend, sipping a martini, smirked. She's got no idea who she's dealing with. But Lyra's back was already turned, her silhouette blending into the crowd, though something about her posture said she'd heard every word. The rehearsal started soon after, the stage glowing under soft lights. Vivienne took her place by the Guzheng, her hands poised like she was about to perform a miracle. The first notes rang out, but they were wrong, harsh off-key, like the instrument was fighting her. She tried again, her face tightening. The crowd murmured, confused. The Guzheng, this priceless artifact, wasn't cooperating. Technicians rushed over, fiddling with the strings, but the sound stayed sour. Lyra, clearing plates nearby, paused. She set her tray down, her movements slow, deliberate. Without a word, she stepped toward the stage. The room didn't notice at first, not until her hand brushed a single string. The note was clear, perfect, like a bell ringing in a silent valley. The entire hall went still. Vivienne's head snapped up, her eyes wide. Damien, standing near the bar, choked on his drink. "What the hell are you doing?" he barked, striding toward her. A man in a pinstripe suit, his hair slick with gel, leaned forward in his seat. "Is this part of the show?" he whispered to his wife, who clutched her pearl necklace. "She's going to ruin it," she hissed back, her voice sharp with irritation. Lyra didn't look at them. She adjusted another string, her fingers moving with a quiet confidence like she'd done this 1,000 times. Another note rang out, pure and haunting. The old man in the corner, the Guzheng's luthier, pushed through the crowd. His hands were gnarled, his suit outdated, but his eyes were sharp. "That's Huyen Tam," he said almost to himself. "Only a master could tune it like that." "Where did you learn?" Lyra's hands paused. She looked at the old man, her expression soft but unyielding. "From someone you all buried a long time ago," she said. The words hung there heavy like a door creaking open. The luthier's face changed like he was seeing a ghost. Near the stage, a young violinist from the ensemble, her hair tied back in a messy braid, watched Lyra with wide eyes. She clutched her instrument case, her knuckles white. "She's not just tuning it," she whispered to a fellow musician, a cellist with a nervous frown. "That's a master's touch." The cellist shook his head, skeptical. "She's a waitress. It's a fluke." But the violinist kept watching, her eyes narrowing, as Lyra's fingers moved, each adjustment precise, like a painter perfecting a stroke. The crowd's murmurs grew, some still mocking, others curious. Lyra stepped back, her hands folding in front of her, and picked up her tray again. But the violinist didn't look away, her fingers twitching like she wanted to play along, like she sensed something the rest of the room couldn't yet grasp. The luthier stepped closer, his voice trembling slightly. "That technique, it's not taught anymore. Not since..." He stopped, his eyes searching Lyra's face. The crowd was quiet now, their laughter replaced by a tense curiosity. Lyra didn't answer. She stepped back, her hands folding in front of her, and picked up her tray again. But the luthier didn't move. His gaze locked on her like he was piecing together a puzzle. A woman in a velvet gown, her fingers glittering with rings, whispered to her companion. "What's he talking about? She's just a server." But her companion, a man with a neatly trimmed beard, didn't respond. He was watching Lyra, his brow furrowed like he'd seen something he couldn't explain. Lyra moved to the next table, her tray steady, but her fingers brushed the edge of a glass, and it wobbled slightly before she caught it. The room's attention lingered, the air thick with questions no one dared ask. The gala moved into dinner, the room buzzing with tension. Damien wasn't done. He wanted his control back, wanted the spotlight off Lyra. He caught her as she refilled a guest's water, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Stay in your lane, waitress. This isn't your stage." The woman next to him, her blonde hair piled high and her necklace dripping with pearls, raised her glass. To real music, she said, her voice syrupy with fake sweetness, something a server could never understand. The table laughed a cruel, practiced sound. Another guest, a man with a Rolex and a sneer, leaned back in his chair. "What's next? She's gonna tell us she's some lost prodigy." The room roared again, the kind of laughter that makes your skin crawl. Lyra kept pouring water, her hands steady, her eyes fixed on the glass. "Legends start with truths you twist," she said, so soft it was almost a whisper. The table went quiet. The woman with the pearls blinked, her glass frozen midair. A young woman in a sequin dress, her voice loud from too much wine, stood up pointing at Lyra. "Why is she even here? This is a gala, not a soup kitchen." The crowd's laughter swelled again, but it was uneven now, some guests shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Lyra set the pitcher down of her fingers, lingering on the handle. She looked at the woman, her eyes steady, and said, "Some people belong more than you think." The words were quiet, but they carried a weight that made the woman sit back down. Her face flushed. A man at the next table, his tie loose and his face red from drinking, muttered, "She's got some guts, I'll give her that." But his friend, a woman with perfectly manicured nails, snapped, "Guts don't make you talented." Lyra turned away, her steps measured, but she paused by a table where a single rose lay forgotten. She picked it up, twirling it briefly before setting it back down, her fingers lingering on the petals. As Lyra moved through the tables, a server in a corner, an older woman with tired eyes, watched her closely. She leaned toward another server, her voice low. "That girl's got something. I've seen a lot of folks come through here, but she's different." The other server, a young man chewing gum, shrugged. "She's just doing her job." But the older woman shook her head, her hands smoothing her apron. "No, it's in her hands. Like she's carrying something heavy, but she won't let it break her." Lyra, unaware of their conversation, stopped at a table to clear a plate, her movements fluid but precise. The older woman's eyes softened, like she recognized something in Lyra, a quiet strength that didn't need to shout. The room's noise continued, but for a moment, Lyra's presence seemed to carve out a small, sacred space, unnoticed by the crowd, but felt by those who'd known struggle. Damien leaned closer, his breath sharp with whiskey. "If you're so talented, why are you here wiping tables? Why aren't you up there?" He pointed to the stage, his voice dripping with mockery. Lyra set the pitcher down, her movements slow, deliberate. She looked at him, her eyes locking onto his, and for a moment the room seemed to shrink. "Some people don't need a stage to prove who they are," she said. The words were calm, but they hit like a slap. Damien's face reddened, but before he could respond, a new voice cut through the noise. The MC, a wiry man in a tux, took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, a special announcement. Our anonymous patron is here tonight, Theo Wren." The crowd turned, buzzing. Theo stepped into the light, his presence quiet but commanding, his dark suit simple but sharp. His eyes found Lyra across the room, and for a second, something passed between them, a look no one else caught. As Theo stood there, a server dropped a tray in the back, the crash echoing through the hall. Heads turned, but Lyra didn't flinch. She bent down, helping the young server, a boy no older than 18, pick up the shattered glass. Her hands were steady, guiding his shaking ones. "It's just a tray," she said softly, her voice cutting through the boy's panic. The crowd watched, some smirking, others confused. A woman in a fur stole whispered, "She's acting like she runs the place." But the boy looked at Lyra, his eyes wide with gratitude, and nodded before scurrying away. Theo's gaze lingered on her, his expression unreadable, but intense, like he was seeing something the rest of the room missed. Lyra stood brushing her hands on her dress and returned to her work, but the moment felt charged like a spark waiting to ignite. The crowd's whispers grew a mix of mockery and curiosity as Theo stepped back into the shadows. Vivian's performance was next, the moment everyone had been waiting for. She sat at the Guzheng, her hands poised, her smile practiced, but the music faltered. Notes clashed, jagged and wrong. The crowd shifted uneasy. Vivian's face tightened, her fingers fumbling. Theo stood near the stage, his expression unreadable. He raised a hand, silencing the room. "Can anyone save this performance?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Damien laughed, a harsh barking sound. "What, you gonna let the waitress try?" Theo's eyes didn't leave Lyra. "I'd like her to," he said. The room gasped, then laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. Vivian's face twisted. "You're joking," she said, her voice high. "She's going to touch the Guzheng in front of all these people. This is a concert, not a circus." The crowd roared, delighted by the drama. Lyra stood still, her hands clasped in front of her, her face unreadable. A reporter in the back, her hair pulled into a tight bun, leaned toward her colleague. "This is going to be a disaster. She's nobody." But her colleague, the young man with the crooked tie, wasn't so sure. He pulled out his phone, quietly recording as Lyra stepped toward the stage. The crowd's laughter grew, but it was tinged with something else now, anticipation, maybe doubt. A man in a bow tie, his face flushed with excitement, whispered to his date, "This is better than the performance." Lyra paused at the edge of the stage, her fingers brushing the hem of her dress. She looked out at the crowd, not with fear, but with a quiet resolve, like she was stepping into a memory. The room's noise faded as she moved toward the Guzheng, her steps deliberate, her plain shoes silent on the polished floor. The air felt electric, like the moment before a storm breaks. Damien saw his chance. He stepped forward, his grin wide and cruel. "All right, let's make it interesting. If she can play, I'll fund her career for life. If she can't, she kneels and apologizes to this entire room." The crowd cheered, the energy feverish, like they were watching a fight. Reporters in the back scribbled furiously, their cameras flashing. "This'll be the story of the year," one of them muttered. Lyra didn't move at first. She looked at the Guzheng, her eyes tracing its curves, its strings. Then she spoke, her voice steady, almost distant. "Fine, but when the music plays, don't ask who I am." The laughter swelled, filling the room, but Lyra didn't flinch. She walked to the stage, her steps slow, her plain dress brushing the floor. The crowd's noise faded as she sat, her hands hovering over the strings. The moment hung there fragile, like the silence before a note. Lyra's fingers touched the strings, and the first sound was soft, almost hesitant, like a whisper. Then it grew, a melody unfolding like a flower opening to the sun. The crowd's laughter died, replaced by a stunned quiet. A woman in the front row, her hands clutching a program, let it slip to the floor. Lyra's hands moved faster now, the notes weaving together, each one precise but alive, like they were telling a story. The Guzheng seemed to sing for her, its sound fuller, richer than it had been all night. A man in the back, his glasses fogging, slightly whispered to his wife, "That's not just playing. That's something else." Lyra's face was calm, her eyes half closed, but her hands told the truth, fierce, unrelenting, like they'd been waiting for this moment for a decade. As Lyra played, a woman in a sapphire dress, her face lined with years of high society, gripped her husband's arm. "I've heard this before," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Years ago, at a competition, her husband, a man with a silver watch, frowned, trying to place the memory. The music swelled, pulling them back, and the woman's eyes widened, her hand covering her mouth. Lyra's fingers didn't falter each note, a brushstroke painting a story of loss and resilience. The crowd was no longer a crowd. They were witnesses caught in the spell of a truth they hadn't expected. A young man in the back, his phone forgotten, in his hand, stared at Lyra, his jaw slack, like he was seeing something sacred for the first time. The first note rang out clear and sharp like a heartbeat. The room went silent. Lyra's fingers moved slow at first, then faster, weaving a melody that felt alive, like it was breathing. The piece was Resurgence, the same one Vivian had claimed as her own. But this was different. Deeper, richer, like it was born from pain and polished by time. The stage lights dimmed, a single white beam falling on Lyra. The LED screen behind her flickered, and an image appeared, a grainy photo of a teenage girl at a Guzheng. Her face focused, her hands a blur. Below it, text, composer Lyra No, age 15, disqualified for plagiarism, falsified report by Ardent Media. The crowd gasped. Damien's face went pale, his glass slipping in his hand. Vivienne stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides. Lyra kept playing, her eyes closed, the music swelling until it filled every corner of the room. A young girl in the audience, no more than 12, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom, why is everyone so quiet?" she whispered. Her mother, her eyes wet, shushed her gently, unable to look away from Lyra. The music seemed to pull the room into its orbit, each note a thread tying the crowd to her. A man in a corner booth, his suit rumpled, set down his drink, his hands shaking slightly. He leaned forward, his face a mix of awe and guilt, like he was remembering something he had tried to forget. Lyra's fingers danced across the strings, her plain dress catching the light, transforming her into something almost otherworldly. The crowd wasn't just listening, they were feeling it, their breath syncing with the rhythm. A single tear rolled down the cheek of an older woman, her hands clasped tightly, as if the music had reached into her and pulled out a long-buried pain. The notes faded and the silence was deafening. Lyra stood, her hands resting lightly on the Guzheng. Damien found his voice, but it was shaky. "No, she staged this. It's a fake," he shouted, pointing at her. Vivian jumped in, her voice desperate. "I played that piece first. It's mine." But the reporters were already moving their screens, showing an old video, a teenage Lyra, her fingers dancing across the same Guzheng, the same melody pouring out. The crowd stirred, some guests slipping toward the exits, their faces tight with shame. A woman in a silver dress tossed a rose toward the stage, where it landed at Lyra's feet. Another followed, then another. Damien lunged forward, but security stepped in, their hands firm on his shoulders. Vivienne sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. As the roses piled up, a man in a gray suit, his face lined with years of deal-making, stood and clapped slowly. Others joined, hesitant, at first then louder, until the sound filled the room. Lyra didn't acknowledge it. She stepped away from the Guzheng, her hands brushing the strings one last time like a farewell. A reporter pushed through the crowd, her microphone trembling. "Ms. No, is it true? Are you the prodigy?" Lyra didn't answer. She looked at the reporter, her eyes steady, and walked past her steps, slow but sure. The crowd parted, their whispers, a mix of awe and disbelief. A woman in a blue gown clutched her husband's arm, her voice low. She didn't even flinch. Not once. Her husband nodded, his eyes still on Lyra, like he was seeing her for the first time. Theo took the stage, his voice calm but cutting. "This morning my company acquired Ardent Media. Every fraudulent deal, every lie will be exposed." The room went still again. Damien's mouth opened, but no words came. Vivian's head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. Theo turned to Lyra. "The Celestia Foundation needs a new artistic director. I'd like you to consider it." The crowd erupted, applause rolling like thunder. Lyra didn't smile, didn't bow. She nodded, once her hands folding in front of her. The reporters swarmed, their questions overlapping. "Is this true? Are you the prodigy?" Lyra didn't answer. She stepped off the stage, her steps as steady as ever, and walked through the crowd, their eyes following her like she was a ghost coming back to life. A week later, the fallout was everywhere. Damien's face was plastered across news sites, his company's dirty deals laid bare. A blogger, her posts sharp and unrelenting, dug up emails showing his role in Lyra's scandal a decade ago. The comment sections exploded, calling him out, tearing him down. Vivian's social media went silent. Her sponsorships pulled, her name dropped from every major festival. Lyra, meanwhile, was nowhere to be seen. She didn't give interviews, didn't post, but in a small music shop downtown, she sat at an old piano, her fingers brushing the keys, not playing, just touching. The shop owner, an older man with a gray beard, watched her from behind the counter. "You're her, aren't you?" he said, his voice soft. Lyra looked up, her eyes meeting his, and gave a small nod. The man smiled like he'd known it all along. Damien wasn't done. He broke free from security, his face red, his voice raw. "You think they respect you?" he shouted after her. "They're just using your name, your story." Vivian, her makeup streaked with tears, stood up. "You'll always be alone, Lyra. Your music, it's too cold." The crowd ignored them, their applause still ringing. Lyra paused just for a moment and turned back. "I'm not here for your respect," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm here for what's mine." She reached for the Guzheng one last time, her fingers brushing a final note. It hung in the air, clear and final, like a door closing. She walked away, the crowd parting for her, their whispers trailing in her wake. In the days that followed, the gala became legend. A grainy video of Lyra's performance went viral, shared by people who'd never heard of her before. Comments poured in. "This is what justice looks like." She owned them without saying a word. Lyra didn't read them. She was in a quiet studio, tuning a new Guzheng, her hands moving with the same care she'd shown that night. A young student, her eyes wide with admiration, watched from the doorway. "Can you teach me?" she asked, her voice small. Lyra looked up, her face softening. "If you're ready to listen," she said, her fingers brushing a string, letting a single note fill the room. The student nodded, her hands trembling with excitement, and sat down ready to learn from the woman who'd turned silence into a symphony. Months later, a small concert hall hosted a master class, and Lyra stood at its center, surrounded by young musicians clutching their instruments. She adjusted a student's posture, her touch gentle but firm, her voice steady as she explained the Guzheng's resonance. The students hung on her every word, their faces lit with awe. A parent in the back, her coat still damp from the rain, whispered to another, "She's the one from the gala, right? The one who shut them all up." The other parent nodded, her eyes on Lyra. She didn't just play, she rewrote the story. Lyra didn't hear them. She was focused on a boy struggling with a chord, her hands guiding his, her patience unwavering. The room felt alive, like the music was a bridge connecting them all to something bigger. A year later, the hall was different, brighter, warmer, packed with people who'd come for her. Lyra stood on stage, the same Guzheng before her, its strings gleaming under the lights. The crowd was on its feet, their applause a wave that didn't stop. She wore a simple white dress, no jewelry, no flash. Theo stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on hers. They were married now, though no one in the room needed to be told. It was in the way he looked at her, the way she leaned into him just for a moment. The screen behind them glowed with a single line, "Legend of sound, Lyra no." She sat at the Guzheng, her fingers finding the strings, and resurgence filled the air again, stronger, fuller, like it had been waiting for this moment. The crowd didn't just listen, they felt it, their eyes wet, their hands clasped. The music ended, and the room held its breath. Lyra stood, her face calm, her eyes bright. She didn't need to say anything. The truth was in the air, in the roses at her feet, in the way the world had shifted. She'd been mocked, buried, forgotten. But she was here now, undeniable. The crowd rose again, their cheers a tide that carried her forward. She stepped off the stage, Theo at her side, and the screen flickered one last time. The girl they mocked, the legend they will never forget. For anyone who's ever been judged, dismissed, or silenced, this moment was theirs too. You weren't wrong. You weren't alone. Your truth matters, and it always will. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.